The story we're about to tell takes us way back in time. In fact, as far back as an era that predates history, to an age where the people of ancient Italy were still taking shape. Among them were the Etruscans. In the 8th century before Christ, an Etruscan aristocrat was part of the ruling elite of his time. The aristocracy ruled over military, religious and social matters and expressed its preeminence in various ways. Aristocratic warriors were conspicuously armed with bronze and more rarely iron weapons. The crested helmet gave warriors a solemn, menacing countenance. They were protected by round or oval shields made with bronze or leather and wood. The metal shields, whose use may have been more ritual than practical, were elaborately decorated. Some warriors completed their body armour with a bronze cuirass. They fought first and foremost with their spears, which featured a heavy bronze or iron tip and a butt spike at the opposite end. But the most exclusive aristocratic weapon of all was the sword, which was reserved to a few high-ranking warriors. They could be made out of bronze. As for the so-called antenna swords with their characteristic handle, or out of iron, as shorter swords often were. In order to have more freedom of movement, or perhaps to show off their physical prowess, warriors may have fought nearly naked, as suggested by some depictions, such as this bronze statuette found near Reggio Emilia. Indeed, the type of weaponry we saw is suitable for agile, dynamic warriors engaged in heroic duels, such as those described by Homer. At the beginning of our story, about a century earlier, the original Etruscan society was still simple and rather egalitarian, nearly undifferentiated. At that time, villages comprised groups of irregularly distributed huts with extensive shared spaces dedicated to productive social and ritual activities. Villages were generally strategically located to exploit natural resources or to control transport routes. In a society that still lacked strong centers of power, conflict was probably endemic and permanent. And villages needed to be protected. A simple stockade could suffice, as documented at Castelfranco Emilia, or more complex systems were also used, as in the moats, embankments and stockade used in Bologna. The burial grounds were located just outside the villages, serving as a sort of sacred boundary for the community. The huts could be rectangular with a gable roof, such as the one depicted on the stela found in Bologna's San Vitale necropolis and dating back to the 8th century before Christ. But we know that they often were circular or oval with a conical roof. The huts were made with materials that could be easily found in the local surroundings, mostly perishable materials such as wood, which was used for load-bearing structures. The walls were made out of trellis of woven branches, plastered with clay or with bricks made of dried clay. The foundations could be made with stones, pebbles or wooden beams, while the roofs were covered bundles of reeds or straw of cereals. The cinerary urns made in Tyrrhenian and southern Etruria were often shaped like the dwellings of that era. We can thus imagine that the walls of Etruscan homes were decorated with the same motifs. Roofs could be decorated as well, with the ends of the roof poles shaped to look like waterfowls. The villages earned their sustenance through agriculture, livestock raising, and forestry. The animals they raised were mainly sheep for their meat, milk, and wool, which was one of their main textiles. Pigs for meat and cattle, which were mostly devoted to help the agricultural work and transports. They cultivated cereals such as wheat and spelt, vegetables, and fruits such as apples, plums, and grapes. They harvested hazelnuts and sloes from local woodlands. Vines were grown on the margins of cultivated areas, where they transitioned into woodlands and uncultivated land. The grapevines used tall trees such as poplars as natural support structures. The Etruscans' original vine training system, known as lambruscaia, using a living support, gave rise to the piantata system of the Po Plain, which is still in use today, and is different from the low-growing vineyard originally from Greece. Viticulture played a prestigious role in light of the symbolic and ritual significance of wine. During the 8th century before Christ, socio-economic evolution brought about more complex social structures, with elites that emerged as a dominant aristocracy by the end of the century. The practice of aristocratic banquets, shared among peers, acquired important social value as the sharing of food became part of a ritualized event in which wine took a key role. Hunting was an activity closely related to the elites and closely reflected aristocratic and warrior values. It's likely that a show of hunting skills was part of the rituals to initiate a youth into the class of adults who were allowed to use weapons. Aristocrats also dealt with religious issues, as evidenced by some impressive grave goods found in Etruscan burial sites in the Adriatic area, in which armor and symbols of civil and religious power were equally represented. Etruscan spirituality, which was probably based on sun worship and may have included resurrection myths, transpired through their funeral rites, which were based in large part on cremation. The body of the dead aristocrat was prepared for viewing before a procession brought him to the funeral pyre in the necropolis. The dead aristocrat was accompanied by objects that symbolized his or her social status, symbols of military and social power for a warrior, and jewels, domestic tools, and status symbols for a noblewoman. The highest-ranking individuals were cremated with a wealth of grave goods: arms, dismantled chariots, horse trappings, bronze vessels, pottery, offerings of food, personal ornaments, instruments, and other valuable objects. For the most illustrious among them, funeral feasts revolved around ceremonies that were very similar to those of the ancient Greeks, as in Homer's description of the funeral of Patroclus in the Iliad. There on the spot where great Achilles showed, they eased their shoulders and disposed the load. While those deputed to enter the slain heap with a raising pyramid the plain, 100 foot in length, 100 wide, The growing structure spreads on every side. High on the top, the manly course they lay. And well-fed sheep and sable oxen slay. Achilles covered with their fat the dead, and pile victims round the body spread. Then jars of honey and of fragrant oil suspends around, low bending o'er the pyre. 4 sprightly coursers, with a deadly groan, pour forth their lives, and on the pyre are thrown. The pyre would burn for several hours, until the body had fully combusted and the corpse was purified. The cremation ceremony included feasts and banquets, animal sacrifices, singing and dancing, funeral games, and ritual performances related to rites of passage, such as armed dances or duels between warriors. One such rite seems to be depicted on a funerary stele found a few years ago near Merano di Castenaso, Bologna province, in a necropolis dating back to the early 7th century before Christ. It shows 2 dueling warriors, their swords held high, tacking a nimble leap or a dance step. And next to them are depicted solar and animal symbols of religious significance. The funeral rites moved to the area of the necropolis reserved for the dead person's family or clan. Once the funeral pyre had cooled down, the remains of the dead were collected together with the other ashes. The bones were washed, then wrapped in cloth and placed in the cinerary urn. A few grave goods were placed in the urn, which traditionally consisted of a biconic vase covered with a bowl. Where what was left of the pyre was thrown into a pit excavated for the occasion. The cinerary urn, which personified the departed, was then buried, wrapped in a cloth held together by a clasp or brooch. Finally, the grave goods were added. Some came from the pyre itself, while others were prepared beforehand. The grave was closed with wooden boards or stone slabs, with a small mound of earth on top. A stone marker indicated its location. Numerous burials from an original and at the time unidentified culture were discovered near Bologna in the mid-19th century by Count Giovanni Gozzadini, an aristocrat who championed local culture archaeology, a still young discipline at the time. He named this culture Villanovan, after his country residence in Castenaso, which was called Villanova. The Villanovan culture, which flourished between the 7th and 9th centuries before Christ, is now deemed by most scholars to be the earliest expression of the Etruscan civilization. Indeed, it is present in all areas where Etruscan culture subsequently emerged. It was a key experience in defining an Italian cultural identity. The Villanovan archaeological heritage is preserved in numerous museums in Emilia-Romagna, since remains of this culture are present throughout the region. In the Po plain, the most important settlements were near Bologna and on the Adriatic coast at Verrucchio. The Etruscan landed gentry, who were also warriors, controlled the territory and its resources. The ability to move rapidly over medium and long distances was essential in territorial control. Horse ownership thus became a source of power, and the difficult and expensive task of raising horses was reserved for military and ceremonial purposes. Horses were used to draw carts, carriages, and for war chariots, or as mounts. As early as the Bronze Age, horses had been used as draft animals, and the chariot had become a symbol for aristocratic warriors. Starting in the 8th century before Christ, warriors began to move on horseback, thus acquiring unprecedented mobility and the possibility of controlling far larger territories than previously imaginable. The presence of a social elite that controlled the lion's share of resources, including the mineral resources that were mostly concentrated in Etruria, also gave new life to commercial and cultural exchanges and enormously extended the sphere of influence of Turanian cultures. Artisanal activities, which were controlled by the aristocracy, achieved exceptionally high levels of quality, from goldsmithing to amber, bone, and ivory objects. A particularly characteristic, elegant, and prized material was a type of black, glossy ceramic, which was made carefully, controlling the quantity of oxygen available during the firing of clay. Aristocratic women also played a key role in manufacturing, particularly in weaving, the quintessential art of noble women. Although only a few items have reached us, they're highly prestigious. They were found at the Verrucchio burial sites on the northern Adriatic coast. Aristocratic women were checked out as sumptuously as their male counterparts. Noble women wore their hair in 1 or 2 long braids, sometimes adorned with spirals made of gold or bronze wire. They sometimes covered their heads with a round mantle that framed their faces and was held in place by fine brooches. Long tunics made with coloured woven cloth with embroidered borders and metal decorations. Around their waists they wore elegant belts with lozenge-shaped embossed bronze clasps. Ornaments and jewels, such as brooches, were mostly made of bronze, or more rarely gold and silver, and were decorated with items made of bone, Baltic amber, ivory, and coloured glass beads. Earrings, necklaces, and thin bracelets made of bronze or gold were equally exquisite. Footwear was often soft boots, snugly fitting. Metalwork in particular testified to the importance of this culture during the Iron Age in Italy and abroad. Metal objects from Etruria were widely found throughout the Mediterranean and across the Alps. Towards the end of the 8th century before Christ, and during the following century, a phenomenon that was impacting the entire Mediterranean had a huge influence on an Etruscan world that was still taking shape. Products, decorative motifs, ideologies and myths from the Near East began to spread in the area, brought by aggressive Phoenician trading, and changed cultural and social mores. They emphasized the social role of the ruling aristocracy, which drove societal evolution through its control of trade and luxury goods. Known as the Orientalizing period, due to the provenance of many of the cultural innovations of the time, the era was very much tied to Greek trade between Etruria and the Near East, and Greek activity in the Western Mediterranean became increasingly important in the emergency of the Etruscan civilization. The military realm was transformed as well with the adoption of hoplite Greek weaponry. Etruscan communities to the north of the Apennines participated fully in this renewal, but they maintained some of the cultural aspects of the previous phase for a longer period of time. They played a decisive role in the relations between the Italian peninsula and Europe beyond the Alps. One of the most important innovations was the adoption of writing, in which we have an interesting example in the inscription on this little vase from the Archaeological Museum in Bologna. I am the small jar of Venu and Ukiutami. I was made by Anna Remiro. The establishment of the first Etruscan cities also dates back to this period. They include Velsna, Felsina for the ancient Romans, the current city of Bologna. The Etruscan civilization, by now fully mature, quickly spread to the Po Plain. A league of 12 cities was formed in the Po Plain, with Velsna as its de facto capital. It became as important to the similar confederation existing in the proper Etruria, located between the Arno and the Tiber rivers.
In Tuscorum iure, bene omnis Italia fuerat.
Italy was almost entirely under Etruscan domination, wrote Cato. Even Livy wrote about how the power and prestige of the Etruscans extended from the Alps to the Strait of Messina. Indeed, the Etruscans were the first civilization to exert their influence over nearly the entire Italian peninsula.